So thank you for attending the unofficial Pleasant Hill districting discussion on communities of interest and drawing fair maps. I'm excited to introduce you to our special guest presenter today, Sitza Goffard, with the Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. And Sitza focuses on fair redistricting and voter empowerment. He previously worked on affordable housing and Section 8 rental assistance programs for the city of Boston. He also spent several years at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, leading projects to tackle racial discrimination in housing and lending. His research and articles have been published by the Brookings Institution, Cato Institution, U.S.-China Perception Monitor, and National Bureau of Economic Research. In addition, he's an avid public transportation enthusiast and served on the advisory board of Washington, D.C.'s transit system to advocate for more equitable metro and bus coverage. Sitza completed his graduate studies at Harvard Kennedy School and Tsinghua University in Beijing as a Schwarzman Scholar. He received his undergraduate degree from Harvard, and he served as class president and co-led a citizenship mentoring program for elderly Asian immigrants. So thank you for joining us tonight, Sitza.
That's very nice, Michelle. I wasn't expecting you to go through my whole bio.
I found it online.
Yeah, you really dug through. That's very nice of you. Thank you. Well, hi, everyone. My name's Sitza Goffard. I'm the Senior Voting Rights Coordinator at, you say the Asian Law Caucus, or ALC. We're a nonprofit civil rights group based in San Francisco, but we do work all around California, especially Northern California. And I work on the voting rights team, which works on political empowerment, civic engagement, especially for like historically underrepresented groups. And I'm joined by my awesome colleague and our team leader, Eileen. Want to introduce yourself, Eileen?
And not after that bio.
We can pull up your bio too. You want us to pull up your bio?
I'm only kidding. My name's Eileen Ma. I go by she, her pronouns, and I work with Sitza as part of the voting rights team housed at Asian Law Caucus. I'm actually a part of the Asian Americans Advancing Justice Affiliation, which is 5 different civil rights organizations working in the Asian Pacific Islander community. And I work on a national voting rights project where we seek to support groups that are doing voting rights advocacy in various spaces and to find ways to just bolster the power of API representation generally. So happy to be here tonight, mainly just to watch Sitza work and to be a resource as possible and to consider what future support we can provide as well. So thanks for having me as well.
Thank you, Eileen. And Eileen's actually she has a legal background. She's a lawyer and she's worked in this space for a long time. I'm more of just like, my background's more in like data, demography, mapping. So I'm excited to work with you all to think about how we can build some maps that are representative of your communities in Pleasant Hill and kind of think through how to get more involved in the process, because it's really exciting.
I want to add just really quickly that I'm also an organizer at heart, that while I am a lawyer by training, that I really cut my teeth as a union and community organizer. So I bring that lens first and look forward to supporting you all in that capacity as well as possible.
Awesome. So yeah, I have some slides, and Eileen and I can talk about, just give maybe a little bit of an overview, because we've done this sort of work in other towns and counties around California. So maybe just get everyone on sort of sort of equal footing here and share some background. But this is a really exciting opportunity in Pleasant Hill. We usually present about redistricting, but in Pleasant Hill, we're talking about districting because it's the first time ever that Pleasant Hill, at least for city council, is moving from at-large elections to district elections. And what that means is instead of Pleasant Hill altogether electing, I think it's 5 city council members, they've decided recently, just a week or 2 ago, to move to district-based elections where you vote, where sort of it's divided, the city is divided up into city council districts, and each of those districts has its own representative. And historically, that leads to more diverse representation and representatives who are a little bit more tied to their communities, and hopefully more accountable and more responsive to community needs too. There's a lot of research on that topic, and I'd be happy to send you articles about it. But it's definitely I think overall a pattern that we see. So is this working? Can you all see this? Okay. Well, I guess some of the goals for today are just reviewing what the districting process is about and talk about the timeline in Pleasant Hill and the ways to get involved. And actually, I'd love to hear from you all on what you've seen about that, because I haven't seen too much yet. But they're supposed to have a timeline published. And then identify ways to get involved and learn about how we can map together and describe our community for districting. So what is districting or redistricting? Districting is the process of drawing legislative district lines. Normally, in most places, it happens every 10 years after the census. But in this case, it's happening when an at-large district, such as Pleasant Hill, transitions to district-based elections. And it's needed, or one of the obviously the primary things to make sure we do is to make sure that districts are equal in size and reflect any population changes. So once Pleasant Hill goes to district elections, actually every 10 years, they're going to redraw the lines. But because this is the very first time, there are no district lines. And so they're going to have to come up with a map entirely from scratch, which means that this is a really big opportunity to have your political voices heard and I guess increased representation for you all. And as you can see on this map, this is an oversimplified example, but districting and redistricting is really important for political representation. I'm sure you've heard the term gerrymandering before, but can really lead to a wide variety of different political outcomes depending on how the map is drawn. And so hypothetically here you have like 10 yellow dots and 10 green dots or people. And you could say hypothetically that each of these colors represents a political party. And so in this case, you have 20 people, let's say in this town, and 10 are green and 10 are yellow. But the way you divide these people up into districts can have a big influence on how these folks are represented. And so in this particular example, you have three districts that would elect someone who's yellow or is represented by someone yellow and someone green, even though technically you have a 50-50 split. And so it's really important to be thoughtful and careful about how you draw the maps to ensure equitable representation. And districting takes into account all residents, not just people who can vote or people who are citizens. That's something that's in the law. And of course, we all deserve to be represented no matter what our citizenship is. So as I said, how do district maps affect our communities? They determine political power for the next 10 years at least, every time you redraw the lines. It can make it easier or harder for us to elect candidates who represent our values and priorities. And it really affects our ability to hold politicians accountable, build coalitions, and work with our neighbors for change. So who draws the lines? It actually varies between cities and counties and states. You could have a governing body, and like the incumbents, the elected officials themselves drawing their own lines. You could have an independent commission, a group of unelected, sort of randomly selected citizens who draw the lines. And that's something that happens at the state level when they're redrawing congressional district lines, for example. And you can have advisory or hybrid commissions that sort of provide advice, and then the governing body ends up voting on whether or not to adopt that map. And this happens at all different levels of government. As I said, it happens at the state level. It happens, congressional districts and state assembly districts. But it also happens at the county level. It happens for city councils, board of supervisors, school boards, special districts, you name it. Almost any type of political jurisdiction is subject to districting and redistricting. So it gets really technical and in the weeds, and that's what we think a lot about on the voting rights team at ALC. Oh yeah. So there are obviously rules for map drawing. It's not totally arbitrary. When line drawers create district boundaries, they have to consider the following criteria in ranked order. So the first is population equality. So every district has to have roughly the same number of people. And usually that's interpreted legally as plus or minus 5% of population deviation. They have to conform to the Voting Rights Act, to civil rights law, and of course the US Constitution. They have to be contiguous, so they can't be split up into many different parts. They have to be one, connected area. It has to leave neighborhoods and communities of interest together, and we'll explain more about what that is. But it has to essentially be responsive to community feedback. This next step, number 5, is more specific to counties, but it should try to leave cities and census designated places as intact as possible. It should respect natural and person-made boundaries. So that could be lakes, it could be roads, highways, you name it. And then finally, it should try to be relatively compact, and so it shouldn't be some long wiggly snake that sometimes you see in highly gerrymandered. I'm sure you may have seen this in maps or in textbooks, of districts that are highly gerrymandered and not at all compact and clearly drawn to benefit some sort of party or an incumbent. That's not supposed to happen. Line drawers may not draw lines to favor or discriminate against the political party. It should really be respecting these in this order. Eileen, you wanna share anything there about the legal requirements? Any questions?
I'll just say really briefly.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say really briefly that in districting and redistricting, right, we're balancing a lot of factors, I guess is the word, right? You're looking at the state laws, right, including the California Voting Rights Act. In this case, because we're talking about a municipality, we're also looking at local governance rules, in this case, the state general law. Then you're looking at general redistricting principles that apply here in California. And then you're looking at federal laws, including the VRA and sort of jurisprudence that has determined how the VRA is applied. And so I think that these general principles are important to keep in mind. And then it's also helpful to keep in mind that there's these other factors that might sort of influence your thinking about drawing the lines.
Definitely. Thanks, Eileen. Also, if there are any questions, please feel free to just stop and interrupt me. I don't mind being interrupted at all. But yeah, communities of interest are really important. It's the way that residents can actually influence the process and tell line drawers, like, this is where my community lives. We would like to be together rather than like split up, which would make it much harder to advocate for your policy needs. And so line drawers legally have to consider communities of interest when they draw the lines. And what is a community of interest, or a COI, we often abbreviate it as? A COI is a community with shared social or economic interests. It can be helpful to describe COIs by identifying their shared characteristics or policy needs. So that sounds very broad and a little bit vague, and it is quite broad. I would say it's more of an art than a science. There are a lot of ways that you could identify a COI. There are shared characteristics like cultural or ethnic background, religious background, language characteristics, whether or not you have a high population of like limited English speakers, for example. People who work in a certain employment or industry, certainly income level, economic demographics like the share of renters versus homeowners. So those are in terms of characteristics and demographics. And then you also have a lot of shared interest in policy concerns. So if a group of people in a neighborhood is really concerned about certain environmental conditions, or the infrastructure, public transit of the neighborhood, or healthcare access, education access, affordable housing, services for elders. This is just a very short list. It could go on, but these are all different ways you can define a community of interest and link a group of people together. Under California law, community of interest cannot include a shared relationship with political parties or political candidates. It also can't just focus on, you can't just focus on one of them, or you really shouldn't. It's a better idea to sort of link a few of these together and talk about why a community is cohesive and has a lot in common. So the community is just general slide to say community voices matter. This is really where your input will help shape the process. This is the way for line drawers to understand your community and where it lives. And they want to hear from you directly. A huge part of the process is COI input. So there's actually dedicated stages of the process where they wanted to collect your feedback about where your communities live and what matters to them. And that's how they will end up drawing the lines. So it's really central to the districting process, to understanding this concept of the communities of interest. And so we're encouraging everybody, once it gets to that stage, where we're encouraging everybody to share your COI input with the city council that will end up, and the mappers that will end up drawing the lines. And I'll share an example of what that type of input may look like. but generally you want to make sure you state your name and your community, give them specific boundaries of where your community is located. So talking about streets and landmarks or parks, things that are very specific that they can point to so they can draw the lines more accurately. And then talking about characteristics that your community shares from the list I presented earlier. So similar backgrounds like language skills, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, relevant history or data that you want to point to, and then certainly highlighting any similar policy needs. And then if there are any neighboring communities that are, let's say it's geographically a different neighborhood, and it's not technically the same, you wouldn't identify it as the same neighborhood or community, but you think they have a lot in common with, and you think that they would be well suited to be drawn into one district, that's also something important you'd want to share. So here's an example of a public comment. This is a template that we've often given to folks who are engaging in this process. And many people have used this to make either written or oral testimony in front of their city council or whoever ends up drawing the lines. It doesn't need to be long, it can be a couple paragraphs. And I can email this around, but this is just an example. If you want to screenshot it or something. Go back to this. Okay. So we talk a little bit about the process. So Pleasant Hill, as I mentioned, just voted, I want to say, was it last week, Michelle? Last Monday to transition to district elections?
Yes, last Monday. Our next meeting will be the 20th, this Monday.
Yes. So they voted last Monday, and actually as of last Monday, the 90-day clock starts ticking. There's a legal process that's spelled out in legislation in the California Elections Code, and it says they have to complete the districting process within 90 days. This is something that community advocates, to my knowledge, have been pushing for a long time, and finally the city council has, decided to take some action. And going forward, they have to hold at least 4 public hearings to gather community input about this. So they can't just, this is not a secret process. They can't just do this behind closed doors. This has to be public. They have to have at least 2 hearings before drawing the draft maps. And those are the hearings when they'll really be considering the community of interest testimony and hearing input from people about where the line should be drawn. And that is the stage where you might, for example, if you have a map of your community of interest or a proposed draft map of all 5 of the city council districts that you might want to see, that's when you might want to present it. It's definitely at the beginning stages. And then then the mappers take a look at all that community input and all the data, and then they start mapping, and then they'll come out with draft maps, and they have to publish those online for, I think, at least a week at minimum. And then hold at least 2 more public hearings to get feedback about those maps. And they might make tweaks to them. And then after all those 4 public hearings, then the city council would vote to adopt the final map, taking into account all the feedback they've received. They have to allow for comments to be collected in person, electronically, or in writing. And of course, they should be, this is in general, a best practice and I think a legal requirement for most meetings, but the meetings have to be accessible to people with disabilities, and language assistance has to be provided as well in certain languages. So if you know anyone who wants to get involved, definitely encourage them to, because again, the clock just started ticking, and within the next 3 months, we're going to have our district lines. So this is a really critical moment for your feedback and your input to help shape the process. And this is a really, really special opportunity. We don't often see places that are transitioning from sort of a blank slate and having to draw their district lines. So I think anything could happen, and a lot of it depends on what they hear from the community. So these are ways to get involved. You can provide input on your community of interest, and that can mean calling into a public hearing or going in person to a meeting. You could submit a comment via email, or you can use online tools to draw your community or a draft map proposal. And those I don't, I think those are supposed to be put up at some point on the city website. I haven't seen them yet, but we can certainly be in touch when those are posted and try to send out the links. There should be a way to, yeah, to simply upload if you want to draw a map or draw your community of interest, to upload that using an online tool. And then, of course, once the mappers come out with the official draft maps, that will also be a critical opportunity for us to provide input and to look at whether or not the proposed maps keep your communities of interest and your neighborhoods you care about together. So that's it for my initial slides. Are there any questions about districting and kind of how the process works at a very high level?
Actually, maybe before the question, I'd like to add one thing.
Yeah,
if I
go
may.
for it.
Just it's related to communities of interest, I think, but it's really the matter of race. You know, you'll notice in the slide it talks about cultural and ethnic groups that might share a community of interest. The one thing to keep in mind is that you can't just draw lines based on race, right? Because that would be seen as a form of discrimination, and that's based on Supreme Court precedents. And so race can't be the predominant factor. Of course, it is a factor in many ways, and race and racial discrimination is often something a factor that drives us into situations where you have to, you know, redraw some lines. But again, it can't be the only factor. And then I wanted to add as well that under our state laws, that while the most simple and maybe conventional thing to do would just be to draw the number of districts that you currently have, the number of council members that you currently have, the state law does provide that you could draw a different number of districts, right, as well as change your system to a different number of districts plus an elected mayor, because I think that question had come up before in some of our earlier conversations. So I just wanted to flag that as well.
Right, definitely. So if folks here feel that Pleasant Hill would be better served by having, you know, 7 city council members, for example, if that's something that people have felt for a long time, this is actually a really good opportunity to bring that up, because it would be relatively easy that, you know, for the city council to think about that question and end up drawing 7 districts. Maybe easy is not the right word, but this would be a natural opportunity to bring that that complaint up, I guess, that grievance. Do we have another question from Roxanne?